Welcome to science class. Today we are going to investigate the transport of materials across the cell membrane. Recall that the membrane is made of phospholipids, which are part water soluble, part water insoluble. As small as cells are, the kinds of things that typically cross them are atoms or molecules, only a few dozen atoms large at best, and they are incomprehensibly tiny. If my math is correct, and it should be, I used Google, a glucose molecule is to a typical human cell what a football stadium is to the planet, around 1/100,000th the diameter. A cell contains something like 100 trillion atoms, and a much smaller but still absurd number of atoms and molecules pass through the cell membrane every second. But not all materials are moved in the same way, and the movement of this material is crucial for understanding homeostasis. Let's get started. The main theme here is that we are describing a specific mechanism for achieving homeostasis. Life cannot exist in a state of equilibrium. The movement of material is absolutely necessary to maintain inner balance. I haven't grown any taller since 2007, but I probably have almost a completely different body than I did back then. Our cells are relentlessly breaking down and building up structures, and our cells are dividing and dying all the time. Neurons and muscle cells don't really do this. You will die with the brain you were born with, but the molecules that make up those cells might all be replaced. It's possible that my body 50 years from now won't have any of the original atoms that are contained within me right now. This is the biological version of the ship of Theseus. Our diet provides the raw materials for this to occur, but in order to use these materials, they must cross the cell membrane. Why do materials move across the membrane? Well, an obvious answer is because they need to in order to maintain life. But a simpler answer is that many of them have no choice. In a fluid system, which our mostly water-laden bodies are, dissolved substances will spread out into equal concentration. The act of this process is called diffusion. The fragrance of an air freshener, the warmth of a space heater, drink powder dumped into a glass, the fart you just ripped in the back seat, all of these things will diffuse to uniformly fill their container. It's a law of physics. Carbon dioxide purges itself from our bodies because it is moving from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. Diffusion is an inevitable process, so it requires absolutely no effort by the cell. Particles will simply spread out so that they achieve a uniform distribution in the environment. Particles in even distribution are said to be in equilibrium. The reason oxygen diffuses into our bloodstream is because the concentration of oxygen in the bloodstream within our pulmonary capillaries is much lower than the air outside our lungs. This is also aided by the air being at a higher pressure inside our lungs. Breathing is not necessary. Well, it is for us because we are so large, but many animals don't breathe. Jellyfish simply allow dissolved oxygen in the water to pass into their gelatinous bodies. Insects don't breathe. They have special tubes all over their bodies and down the length of their appendages, which simply allow oxygen to diffuse into their bodies as well. Hundreds of millions of years ago, when there was more oxygen in the atmosphere, insects were able to grow to huge sizes. Insect size is at the mercy of atmospheric oxygen content. For small molecules like oxygen, carbon dioxide, water, and for lipid-soluble molecules, for example most hormones, passage into the cell occurs directly through the cell membrane. To them, the lipid bilayer is porous like a screen door is to the wind. The key thing to remember about diffusion is that it requires no energy from the cell or organism, which is generally a good thing. Other materials can diffuse as well, such as glucose, which you also need a regular supply of. But glucose is too large to pass directly through the cell membrane. Instead, glucose travels through protein structures called channel proteins in a process known as facilitated diffusion. Again, no energy is required for this, and the glucose naturally flows to where it is needed, inside the cell, where it is constantly being burned up. The channel protein that allows glucose to come through does not allow other compounds through. For every kind of molecule that can be diffused through facilitated diffusion, they have their own custom channel protein. I alluded to this a bit in the last video when I mentioned that the lipid bilayer is not just a lipid bilayer, it's embedded with countless other protein and carbohydrate structures. Water will use a channel protein called an aquaporin, but water does also pass directly through the cell membrane. The movement of water can also be forced across a membrane through differences in concentration in a process called osmosis, which is the diffusion of water across a membrane. Cells are jam-packed with particles, organelles, and all kinds of dissolved substances. Freshwater, single-celled organisms have a constant imbalance problem. The fresh water they live in is extremely low in concentration. We call that a hypotonic solution, one that has much fewer solutes than the solution we are comparing it to. Water is always passively moving into the cells of these organisms, so they actively pump it out with contractile vacuoles, which I mentioned 2 videos ago. If a cell is placed into a hypertonic solution with a concentration of particles much higher than the cell, water will leave the cell. If concentrations are equal inside and outside of the cell, we say it is isotonic. Our bodies never achieve isotonic conditions or equilibrium, but that's the way things have to be, otherwise things couldn't move around the way they need to support life. We're always trying to meet that goal, but what if the cell needs to move material against the concentration gradient? That is a process known as active transport. The water pumping we covered earlier is an example, but protein structures are also used in active transport. These proteins, called carrier proteins, have active bonding sites for compounds or ions, so they are highly specific to just a few things as well. The way they can move material against the concentration gradient is that they change shape, otherwise diffusion might push the system towards equilibrium. ATP is required for active transport. In primary active transport, an ATP molecule activates a carrier protein to change shape and dump its content. In secondary active transport, potential that the cell builds up does the work of moving material. An example of this is what happens during muscle contraction. Sodium and potassium ions are pumped using ATP and a carrier protein. This builds an imbalance of charge on one side of the cell membrane, which becomes more positively charged than the other, and that electrical potential energy activates the carrier protein to restore the initial conditions by pumping the ions back to the other side of the membrane. This is like rolling a ball up a hillside. You used energy to get it there, but now it relies on the potential energy to restore its original condition. Finally, there are 2 other very different kinds of active transport: endocytosis and exocytosis. This is where the actual cell membrane is used to engulf or release material. Remember, the internal structures and organelles of cells are also made of lipid membranes, or at least a lot of them are. A vesicle inside of a cell can fuse with the lipid bilayer because they are fundamentally the same. Again, like when Patrick created 1 giant paint bubble from 2 giant paint bubbles. Endocytosis is the action of a cell transforming part of its membrane into a vesicle. It can be a large vesicle or a small one. This is how many predatory protists engulf their prey. Some of your white blood cells do this as well. Exocytosis is the opposite of endocytosis. Cells need to excrete waste in bulk, and chunking out an entire vesicle of material is a great way to do that. That concludes our lessons on the cell membrane. Next time, we are going to explore the energy source for virtually every single organism on the planet: photosynthesis. Thanks for watching.